teaches courses on public affairs, reporting, and the principles of American journalism, race, and reporting. Before earning his PhD in journalism from the University of Kentucky, he worked as a weekly newspaper copy editor and section editor on Long Island, New York. So thank you for coming on. We have our esteemed guest, also second there, CJ Hunt. He's a comedian and filmmaker living in New York City. He is currently a field producer on The Daily Show and with Trevor Noah, and he has also served as a staff writer for A&E's Black and White, and he's a field producer for BET's The Rundown with Robin Lees. Before working in late night, CJ spent 9 years living in New Orleans, where in 2015 he began filming what he thought would be a quick and easy Confederate monument removal. CJ is an alumnus of the Firelight Media Doc Lab and New Orleans Film Festival Emerging Voices program. He is also a 2020 New America Fellow and a regular host of The Moth. A graduate of Brown University's Africana Studies Department, CJ is endlessly fascinated by race and comedy's ability to say what we can't. And then next to CJ, we have another esteemed guest, Dr. Holly McGee. So as a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Holly McGee specializes in U.S. history and African American history with an emphasis on Black women's intellectual history, comparative political activism in the United States and South Africa, and popular culture in the 20th century. Her secondary specialties include local histories of the American South, South African women's history, and oral histories. Currently, Dr. McGee teaches undergraduate courses in Black history and film, culture and counterculture, post-1929 American history, and modern South African history. Before earning her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. McGee earned a BA in English from Dillard University, an MA in Applied Social Science from Florida A&M, and an MA in Afro-American Studies from Wisconsin. At UC, she's been teaching undergraduate courses in Black history and film, culture and counterculture, and African American history in early and colonial America. Dr. McGee's most recent publication, One Day We Are Going Home, The Long Exile of Elizabeth, the biography of famous South African Union activist Elizabeth Mafeking, who was one of the first African women banned by the National Party in 1959 and survived 34 years in self-imposed exile. Thank you for joining us. And then at the far end, we have Dr. Amatheo Banjo. Dr. Banjo obtained her BA in social psychology and earned her PhD in mass communication from Penn State University. She's an associate professor of communication at the University of Cincinnati and serves as an affiliate faculty of Africana Studies and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her teaching centers on developing media literacy skills and awareness, and her research centers on identity, with a special focus on ethnic and transnational creative content, with a particular focus on its impact on the audience's self-concept and value. A child of Nigerian immigrants, Dr. Banjo is uniquely positioned to write, speak, and educate on topics related to social identity, social perception, and cultural differences from an empathetic viewpoint. She has published several books and has consulted for entertainment companies. So thank you for joining us. And last, but certainly not least, is Gerald Crosby, Jr., who is a fifth-year campus leader majoring in interdisciplinary studies with concentrations in marketing and law. Throughout his campus leadership, he has been involved in a variety of organizations such as Student Government, UBSA, UC Starfish, Black Roundtable, and many more. His impact on campus has centered around student advocacy and educating and encouraging the UC and Cincinnati community to become more proactive in their approach to diversity and inclusion. So it's with this great honor that I turn the stage now over to this panel and over to Dr. Cotton to to lead us in our discussion this afternoon.
So I wanted to hello. So I wanted to start off with a somewhat simple question. So having public conversations about the impact of systemic racism on where we are today elicits a lot of response. It elicits rejection of the notion. It connects to a lot of conversations we're having today about active misinformation and disinformation campaigns and current controversies over public school curricula. I guess my question is, how do we get people to understand the impact of past historic and systemic racism on the present?
Well, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. I happen to teach an honors course entitled Uncomfortable Truths. It's Uncomfortable Truths from Africa to George Floyd in American History. And I specifically wanted to teach this class, and it gets to the question that you're asking, because we are in an unprecedented time where a lack of information has led to chaos, confusion, disillusionment, and an utter disregard for individuals. And the easy answer is that we need to be better educated. We need to educate ourselves. We need to not shy away from those uncomfortable truths. And so one of the things that I think that we need to do is we need to begin standardizing uncomfortable conversations in our curriculum. The idea that there is no federal curriculum that deals with or addresses specific needs in our K-12 in our K-12 system is beyond me. The idea that individual states can decide what their history is or what the national history is, or to change a narrative, is incredibly dangerous. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the state of Texas, there are now textbooks that are coming out that are saying very innocuous things to children who don't know any better, but for those of us who are here now, we know that this is a problem. Here's the sentence: Africans came to America to work. There's an entire history that you overwrite. The transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, we can't do this. And so the simple answer, I think, is education, but I'd love to hear what everyone else on the panel has to say.
Yeah, my entry into this conversation is as a comedian and as a filmmaker. So even just a sentence that you said is the reason that I turned to comedy, because for me it is the language most capable of capturing absurdity when we are above anger, right? Like the pure absurdity of Africans came here, right? What a way to describe people who are kidnapped for work, as if we're like, hey, I heard there's some good jobs there. No, we were kidnapped and brought here. So for me, you know, when my anger gets high enough, or when injustice becomes so routine that we are like, this again? Which hashtag person murdered by the police is this? Right? Like a language that exists for capturing capacities of absurdity, for me, often is comedy. For me, I'll answer also this question via monuments, which is not my specialty, but what I've been training a camera on for the past 6 years. Today it's raining, and I want to take us back to a really rainy day in New Orleans. And I love that you are from Dillard. I was like, oh yes. But in New Orleans, the broad grassy medians between two streets are called a neutral ground. That's why my film is called The Neutral Ground. And this is community space. This is space for everybody, right? This is where people barbecue and hang out. If you were to search it on Twitter right now, it wouldn't be stuff about my film. It'd be New Orleanians talking to each other about, I'll see you on the neutral ground side because it's parades this week, right? Mardi Gras beginning. This is also the place that giant 60-foot tall statues to the Confederacy are built. It's where they put them. It's where they put monuments to white supremacist militias that attacked the government, the original Capitol rioters. So that place that should be for all of us is literally occupied by white supremacy. So I just want to talk about this Lee Monument because in 1884, the country didn't know giant Confederate monuments. right? They just didn't exist. Lee had died in 1870. And so in 1884, this Lee monument, 60 feet tall, maybe 80 feet tall with, the pedestal is only 60 feet tall. This was the first giant Confederate monument that we'd seen in the country. It was erected in New Orleans and debuted in front of thousands in 1884. But it was raining, just like today. It was pouring down. So all the thousands of people, the Northerners who would come there to be like, brotherhood between white brothers, all the proud sons and daughters of Confederate veterans, all of these people are assembled, thousands, and it starts raining, so they have to scrap the ceremony, and they send everyone inside. And the only thing that exists from the written record is the program, which shows that a speech was given, as the rain is coming. It's just this guy named Charles Fennerer, who was a state Supreme Court justice, gets on the mic real quick, and he's like, "We would like to present this statue to the mayor of New Orleans, William Behan." And William Behan gets up, and he's like, "Thank you so much to the Confederates, blah, 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 our statue." So, just these two rushed men, if we can picture it, these two men rushing in the rain to dedicate the first giant Confederate monument. 10 years before this moment, those men know each other as well because they're both members of the Crescent City White League, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is a paramilitary group formed between white people explicitly to teach blacks a lesson and teach them to forego further insolence. And in 1874, this group, the Crescent City White League, attacks the government, right, to overthrow Reconstruction, kills cops in the streets, kills the black militia in the streets, successfully takes the State House, holds the State House for 3 days so that the President of the United States has to send federal troops to disperse this white militia. These men not only go free, they're not only allowed to walk back to the house, no prosecution, but then the keys of government are turned over to them. One of the members becomes mayor, one of them becomes state Supreme Court justice, and on a rainy day, just like today in 1884, they crouch and hurriedly unveil and dedicate the nation's first giant Confederate monument. The second giant Confederate monument to Lee happens in Richmond. And 1 year after that, the New Orleans White League has dedicated a monument to their own coup, to their own insurrection. And they renamed the neutral ground where they shot and killed police. They renamed it Liberty Place. They physically renamed the space of their insurrection. They've named the space for everyone. They've named it Liberty Place. And they've named their coup the Battle of Liberty Place. And they built themselves a monument to the brave people who sacrificed their lives for Southern freedom at the Battle of Liberty Place, aka that time y'all went ham and shot all those cops, right? And they renamed this thing, and then they put a plaque on it that explicitly calls out white supremacy. So I say that to say my entry into this conversation is, how do we use structures like Confederate monuments to show people that the history was never neutral, that white supremacy has quite literally built the world that we live in. And so that is the opportunity. We have our work to do because governments, governors and state legislatures are literally punishing us for teaching kids about white supremacy. But these white supremacists were so on Front Street with how they built our world that I think our conversations about symbols, our conversations about what to do about this street name, our conversations about what to do with this dorm name, right, are also conversations about our present, about police, about all of the things that have built our world, pretend to be neutral, but were put in place by white supremacists who were talking white supremacists at the time and hold white supremacy together. How do we use the past to be able to open the doors that it survived and it never went away?
I don't know that I have anything much more to add except that, of course, education is important, and not just at the higher education level, not just with universities, but of course with our children. Another thought that came to me as CJ was talking was just the power of framing. I come from a psychological background, and so I think it's not just important to show how these things happen or what happened, but also how, in terms of understanding the practice of telling stories, and how the intentionality that goes behind the scenes of news stories or television or film, presenting those facts. So one of the things I liked about CJ is that documentary, you talk a lot about digging receipts. You said you were just a comedian, but you also are an educator, right? And so one of the things, if you haven't seen the documentary, that comes up is just what do you do when you can have the evidence? You have the pieces of paper, you have what they actually said. This is not online stuff. This isn't someone's opinion in a forum. So I think that actually presenting evidence can help, but where psychology comes in though is we're very resistant to anything that makes us challenge ourselves. And so we built these forces. And so as I think through I've been thinking a lot about how do you get through and around people's defenses. And I don't have the answer, but I do believe that behind a lot of the defense is people's fear of their own insignificance. And I don't know that white supremacy would be abolished if you just tell people, you're just scared that you're going to be part of the minority and you're not going to be significant, but you will be. I think people want power. And so I haven't figured out the answer for that yet, how to tell people who want power, you don't need to have it. They're going to be like, yeah, I do, and that's it. But at the end of the day, though, I do think that is one of the core issues within people in terms of just trying to elicit change, being open to hearing and seeing their own inadequacies and fears and how it's playing a role in what kinds of stories get told and whose stories we validate. But at the very least, the stories still need to be getting told. And not just by people of color, but even by people by the majority and it shouldn't have to be, but to affirm and validate the reality, a reality that challenges a lot of these false narratives that we are seeing today.
I think that the only thing I would add is acceptance of the history. I think is an important part of the conversation because while you may be able to educate somebody about it, if someone is resistant to hearing the truth, if they are resistant to like actually understanding, the facts and the knowledge that you're giving them, then you will never actually kind of make forward with that conversation. And I think part of that reason would be like white guilt, right? No one wants to feel like a bad person. So if you are constantly teaching the history of slavery and teaching these things to the majority in this conversation, they will be resistant to hearing that, right? Like you might take that personally. You might feel like, well, I didn't have slaves, so like, this is not a big deal, or the world is different because like I have black friends, or I know black people, or we have a black president and a black vice president, like, but that doesn't actually change the facts and the results, of the society and the reality that we live in. And I think that there is a way to accept the history, but not glorify the history. And as we mentioned for the title of this discussion, whose stories gets told, I think that there is just a lot of resistance to accepting that truth. And there is nothing to be glorified right about slavery, but it's still a necessity for us to understand slavery, to understand how we interact as African Americans in this country. And there's nothing to be, glorified about the history of Christopher Columbus, right? But we accept the fact that that happened and that got us here, and we move forward as a culture and as a country. But I feel like until we focus on that acceptance piece, it'd be really hard to move forward with the education, because I feel like we know, everyone in this room knows, the people on the Zoom call knows, like we understand the foundational issue that we have here in America, right? We understand the slavery issues that we have, the racist issues that we have in our country, but we can explain it in a million different ways, right? You can break it down in a million different ways, many different theories, but the truth will always be the same, and until we are able to accept that, I don't think that we will be able to move forward.
Thank you. Another concern, I guess, is are we having too many of our conversations in spaces and with people who cannot or are unwilling to understand the context, and does that in turn hold us back in a way?